So, today on the show, we're honored to be joined by General George W. Casey Jr., a four-star general and one of the most respected military leaders of our time. General Casey served as the 36th Chief of Staff of the United States Army from 2007 to 2011, overseeing the Army during a critical period of transformation and sustained combat operations. Before that, he was a top commander in Iraq, leading a multinational force during some of the most complex years of war. Over his 41-year career, General Casey has built a reputation for strategic leadership, operational excellence, and a deep commitment to the men and women that have served under his command. He holds a degree from Georgetown University and the University of Denver, and he has continued to serve as a thought leader on leadership, national security, and global conflict since retiring from active duty. We'll be talking about everything from his upbringing, early influences, and lessons from the battlefield, to his perspective on leadership, resilience, and the future of global security. General George W. Casey, please welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. That's quite an intro. You set a pretty high bar here.
No, thank you so much for coming. So, General, we just wanted to get a pretty thorough understanding of just kind of what led you to the military. And so naturally, I imagine that your early childhood was a deep foundation in you choosing the career path that you did. So could you take us back to, where you grew up and what your childhood was like?
Sure. So for starters, I was an Army brat. My dad was in the Army, went to Harvard for a year, and then transferred to West Point, where he graduated in 1945. From his perspective, I'm sure he graduated too late to make World War II. So his first assignment was to occupation duty in Japan, where I was born. I was born in Sendai, Japan. And from there on, my childhood was bouncing from one place to another. I went to grade schools in Virginia, North Carolina, and Kansas. And I went to 4 high schools in 3 different countries. United States, Germany, and Italy. So I got bounced around pretty well, but I must say, it was a very broadening experience, particularly the time that I spent in Europe, in Germany, and in Rome. That really it instilled in me a much broader worldview and a desire to look outside the United States and what my immediate neighborhood. And that's really what led me to seek admittance to the Foreign Service School at Georgetown. Especially during the time in Europe, I developed a love of history and political biography. And so why political leaders made decisions when they did and how they interacted with other leaders was always fascinating to me. And that really culminated in my time at Georgetown University, where I was able to devote some time to that.
Okay. So when you were during your childhood, so was there some lessons that you think, that your parents kind of instilled in you that you feel like you carried on into your leadership?
Yeah, one of the things that I tell the MBA students is that, you don't just start becoming a leader when you get to business school. You're from the time that you're a young person, parents, teachers, coaches, and uncles, they instill in you a view of how you look at people and how you want to lead them. I was no different. When I was about 12, my maternal grandfather took me off to the side of the porch at his summer house. I must have looked like I needed a little mentoring. And he said, "George, I'm going to tell you something you should never forget." He said, "You're no better than anyone, and no one's better than you. So treat everyone with respect, but don't take any guff from anybody." And, of course, at 12, that went right over my head. But as I've reflected on it, that more than anything else shaped my leadership style. I treated everybody with respect, but I stood up for what I believed in. And then my dad was, I was going off to college, said, "Never be afraid to try to be the very best." And I didn't fully appreciate the value of the word try until much later. But it led me to have a mindset where I always stretched myself. I always tried to make my organization as the best that it could be. I never got there, but I was always much better than I would have been. And then lastly, my mom. So we bounced around a lot and things weren't great back then. And my mom would always say, when we gripe about this or that, she'd say, "Make the best of it." And that really instilled in me a quality that for the rest of my life, anytime I was thrust into a situation, I always tried to make the best out of it that I could. and from big things to little things.
To try to find that kind of silver lining behind things, right?
Yeah, it's not quite that silver lining. That to me carries a Pollyannish connotation.
Sure.
But it's looking at it and figuring out how you make something good happen out of something that really doesn't look like it's going to start out that way.
Okay. Gotcha. Sure. Fair enough. And so like humility as well, right? It sounds like humility, your father and talking about that and, talking about that you're no better than anyone else. Seems like humility was a pretty important one that they kind of entrenched upon you.
Yeah, it was. Again, I tried to carry that forward, and I had to be humble enough to acknowledge to myself and to others that I couldn't know everything. But at the same time, I was driving to accomplish the mission that I was given. And it's very interesting. It only gets harder as you climb the corporate ladder, because on the one hand, you have to have conviction to drive the execution of the current plan. But on the other side, with the other side of your brain, you got to be looking around for what you missed or where the next opportunity is. And so it's really difficult to compartmentalize your thinking and at the same time drive execution and then look for opportunities.
Sure. Makes sense. That when it comes to like humility, is there times where you feel like, you might end up being too humble when it comes to your approach in some ways or,
Yeah. I mean, I'm the old adage about the person hides their light under a bushel basket. I'm less inclined to toot my own horn.
sure.
I try to let the results speak for themselves. That is not necessarily the best method as you climb the corporate ladder.
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. And then from there, I remember you were saying Georgetown. What was your experience like at Georgetown, and what are some lessons you learned about leadership and philosophy from that university?
Yeah, my time at Georgetown really instilled in me some skills, some core skills that I would need as a leader. It was things like being able to think critically, to be given a problem and to not accept the first solution that you're given, but to challenge the status quo and go back and look at it and ask hard questions. That type of ability to analyze new situations was something that I took away from the Jesuit upbringing. The other thing that they really helped was they really refined my capability to communicate, both orally and in writing. I remember standing up in a very formal classroom having to present a presentation to a group of teachers, and they challenged me, but they taught me how to think. And they taught me how to communicate, and they instilled in me a commitment to serve others, that we're put on this earth not just to be successful ourselves, but to make the world better and to serve others. And so that is something that never left me.
And that's also a deep rooted aspect of the Jesuit tradition.
Service to others. Yep.
So, General, I'm kind of curious. We've spoken a lot about humility, but you touched on the fact that your upbringing, you've traveled a lot. You had a lot of places that you called home, a lot of schools that you ended up attending. I think, there's a lot of similarities I can share. So I came here, early on from Pakistan when I was 2 years old, and my father was an entrepreneur. So we moved all across America. And one thing, I found myself to really work on was confidence. And I wanted to ask you, do you have, your father was a general, but can you talk about like how you kept your confidence up, knowing that you were traveling, a lot, you had different places, new environments. How did you navigate that as growing up?
It's interesting. I developed a mindset that you put me in a new situation and I'll figure it out. And I did it so many times that it became almost rote. And then when I went in the Army and I bounced from assignment to assignment, the ability to adapt to new environment was pretty well ingrained in me. Oops, sorry.
No, you're fine.
The ability to adapt was pretty well ingrained in me. And I was I became very comfortable dealing with people that I hadn't met or interacted with before. I didn't need the comfort of having the same people around me all the time.
Yeah.
Okay. And so now, moving ahead, you leave Georgetown and you have your first deployment. So as a young officer, what were some of your early experiences there?
So yeah, my first deployment was to Germany, and it was to the only U.S. airborne unit in Europe. And I was thrust into a platoon of 30 guys at 22 years old. He said, "You're our leader, Lieutenant." And it was an eye opener for me. And one of the things that I realized immediately was these folks depended on me for their welfare. And that was a pretty big responsibility. And I vowed never to let my troops down. And I worked toward that at every level of command. The other big thing I learned in that first job was I didn't know I could lead. I had been through reserve officer training, had some leadership book learning there, went down to the officer basic course at Fort Benning, Georgia, got a little more book learning there. But now I got these 30 guys and I'm trying to motivate them to accomplish big things. I don't know if I could do it. So I tell this story to the MBAs. About a few months after I got there, the announcement came down that we were going to have a big inspection, that someone from the two-star general's headquarters was going to come down and inspect every piece of equipment in the battalion. So I got the platoon together and I said, okay, we are going to be the best platoon in this battalion. And they all went, yeah, that's great. Let's do it. And so we started working really hard, about 6:30 in the morning until 9 or 10 o'clock at night. It only took about 2 days before the grousing started. Why are we working so hard? Nobody else is working this hard. And I said, shut up, in color. If you want to be the best, you got to work hard. And then I was there with them the whole time. I rolled up my sleeves and got in there with them. Well, fast forward to inspection day, and we just happened to be the last platoon in the battalion to be inspected. And the inspecting officer comes through and he finishes. He turns to me in the hallway and he says, "Lieutenant, of all the platoons I've seen in this battalion, this is far and away the best." And the troops who had been supposed to have been standing at attention at their bunks came leaping out into the hall cheering. That was the first time I knew I could lead, that I could motivate and inspire a group of people to accomplish something that they didn't think they could do. And at 22.
And so these, at that young age, right? Did you feel, because you're 22, did you feel a pushback at all from, any of the other individuals that you were leading?
I not necessarily pushback. My platoon sergeant, who was the experienced one in the platoon, he went along with me, but he was not afraid to take me aside and say, "Lieutenant." And he could say "Lieutenant" like it was you were the dumbest creature in the world.
Just stretch it out.
Point me on and get me back on the straight and narrow.
Okay, gotcha. So now I recall from class you also talking about special forces and you considered joining the special forces. Could you talk about that experience and what led you to?
Yeah, that was Delta Force. They had the United States just made a decision to form Delta Force. This was probably late 70s. And I was offered the opportunity to try out for selection in the second group. So I went down to Fort Bragg and my boss agreed to keep my job open for me. And my wife said, yeah, go ahead and try it. And so I went there, and it was an extremely demanding process. But as I went through it, they couldn't or wouldn't tell us much about what our lives would be like afterwards, after we were accepted. I had my wife and 2 sons, and they were just kind of growing up into school. And my wife was just started a job as a stockbroker. And I was having these long conversations with her on the telephone in the evenings. And it was clear to me that it wasn't going to work for me to say, I can't tell you where I'm going, can't tell you when I'm going to be back, but don't worry. That was not going to work for us. And so after I went through the selection process, I had to go in and tell them, thank you very much, but I can't take your offer. And that was the hardest decision that I'd made up to that time, but I made it and really didn't look back. Occasionally I'd question it, but I didn't dwell on it. I went forward in the new direction.
Yeah. And go ahead, Elise.
That's Delta Force. I think a lot of people hear about like Navy SEALs, but that's tier 1, right?
Yeah, well, yeah.
Wow. And what about your colleagues at the time, or your mentors? Did they give you pushback saying, "Hey, well, what are you doing? Like this is an amazing opportunity"?
Actually, it's interesting. I didn't really know a lot of people in that community. And so I didn't get a lot of pushback from folks. And frankly, I got more advice to stay in the conventional force because that's what I was doing. I mean, my wife, the original plan when I graduated from Georgetown was to do my 2-year ROTC obligation and get out and go to law school.
Wow.
So now it wasn't 2 years. My wife was already working on 8 years, and I was talk about doing something fundamentally different than she decided. So
arranging that whole plan.
Yeah.
So the Delta Force training, could you talk about a little bit of what the training that they made you kind of go through?
Yeah, it wasn't so much training as it was a mental and physical test of your capability to endure. And so, they kept us at Fort Bragg for, I don't know, about 7 to 10 days to get us in shape, because to make sure we were in decent shape, because apparently I was in the second group. The first group that went through, they had a bunch of people drop out because they just weren't in shape. I knew what I was getting into, so I was in pretty good shape. But we did night road marches. We did lots of running and push-ups and sit-ups and things. But the real challenge was modeled after the British SAS selection process that they run in Wales. And there was a chalkboard in our tent, and the tent was just a big tent with straw on the ground, and we had a sleeping bag, and that's where we slept. And the chalkboard, they'd write on it, 8 o'clock, 35 pounds, which meant you had to be ready at 8 o'clock, and your rucksack had to weigh 30 pounds, not including your water, because you had to have 35 pounds on you the whole time. And so we took off with an AK-47, a 35-pound rucksack, and we get to this point on a truck, and we get off, and the trainer would say, "You're here, go here." It's 5 kilometers over the mountainous terrain. And you'd get to the next place, and they'd say, "Okay, you're here, go there." And then they'd weigh your rucksack to make sure that it still weighed 35 pounds. And you just keep doing this all day long until you get to a point where they say, "Get on the truck." And there was never any standard. They said, "Go as fast as you can." And then every night they'd come in and they'd tell one or two guys to pack their stuff and leave. And you never knew what was going on. So it was mentally and physically extremely demanding. And that went on for at least a week. I forget exactly how long it went on. And at the end, they'd take you back to Fort Bragg, and then they go through the out process.
Okay, gotcha. I mean, yeah, definitely very strenuous. And sounds like there's a lot of, it's mentally draining because you don't know when it's going to end, right? So it could be at any.
And you're by yourself. You're not doing this as a group. You're alone in the woods.
Okay, gotcha. So you ultimately, and from there ended up going obviously into that conventional path. And so in your leadership, though, you were commander in Iraq. So could you talk about how you led during the most complex and politically charged periods in recent United States military history?
Sure. As you can imagine, first I'll tell you the story about how I came to the job. So in the middle of May 2004, I was the vice chief of staff of the Army. So I was second in charge of the Army. And Monday morning, my boss came into my office and said, "I need a list of 3 and 4 stars who could replace the current commander in Iraq." I knew the Secretary Rumsfeld was trying to up that to a 4-star commander so that he could be on a better level with the ambassador. So I put together a list of names, and I took it over to my boss that afternoon at his house. And he looked at it and he said, "Your name's not on this list. You could do this." And I said, "I know I could do it, but you asked me to stay here and help you finish this multi-year transformation of the Army. So I didn't put my name on the list." And he just nodded, didn't say anything. Next day, I found out that I find that I'm on the list of 3 people's names who are submitted to the president to be the commander in Iraq. And but I thought I was not in the running. Nobody had really talked to me about it. So I decided I wasn't going to tell my wife, because we were in the process of moving from one place to another in Washington. In fact, the moving van left on Monday morning. They packed us up Monday morning. So I think about Thursday afternoon, I was in my boss's office when he got a call from the Central Command commander who just left the meeting at the White House. And he said, "Casey's going to be the commander in Iraq." So my boss tells me, and I go, "Holy crap." And then I realized that I needed to tell my wife. So I got in the car and drove over to our new house. And I must have got there just as the moving van moved away, because there was no truck there, and all the boxes were in the house. So I start looking for my wife amid the packing boxes. And I find her on the 3rd floor. And suave guy that I am, I said, "You need to stop packing and sit down. I have something to tell you." And I told her I was going to be the commander in Iraq, and she burst into tears. And, we talked the rest of that night, and lots of uncertainty. You have to be confirmed by the Senate to go to these positions. And to do that, I had to get nominated by the president. And the administrivia of it just takes time. So it took about a week or so before I found out when I'd have that I was nominated. And then I had to have a confirmation hearing that took about a month later. So during that period, I turned over my vice chief duties to my successor and really started boning up on the mission. And I went all over Washington, talking to people who were going to support me. I went out to the CIA to get the intelligence picture from Washington, talked to congressmen and senators on the Hill about Iraq, and then to get ready for my confirmation hearings. My alma mater, Georgetown, hosted a conference for me. National Defense University hosted a conference. I mean, I spent the 6 weeks just pouring into the mission and then reading everything I could get my hands on to prepare me for what I was walking into.
Can you talk more about that? Like 6 weeks feels like, geez, not enough time to even, for us, like finish the due diligence process on some of our deals. How do you get intel and make sense of it? And what was that process like?
Look, when you're, as when you're dealing with really new and complex problems, the mind works iteratively. At least that's what I find. You don't get it by reading a couple of books and going to a couple of conferences. You kind of find I go in steps. I get to a level here, and then I do some more reading, talk to some more people, and I get to here. And it's an iterative process that continually builds on what you've got before. And I went over there with the first ambassador, was John Negroponte, who was a seasoned diplomat, and he and I put our heads together and said, "Look, we've got to work together if this is going to work out." So we adopted the one team, one mission mantra. And then we were given 30 days from the time we got to Iraq to get our feet on the ground, he to establish his embassy, me to establish my headquarters. But then we had to build a plan to brief the president on for our plan to succeed in Iraq in 30 days. And so it was a combination of everything I'd done in Washington, 30 days on the ground. And we had enough time to put a plan together, but we were seasoned enough to know that it was maybe an 80% solution.
Yeah.
And we knew it was going to change and that we were going to have to adapt. But it was so important to be clear to the men and women who work for both of us what we wanted them to accomplish. And we got that to that point. Interestingly, the vision that we articulated then was the vision that wound up being executed over the whole Iraq mission. That didn't change. The strategy to get there changed a few times along the way, but the vision remained the same. It was an Iraq with a representative government and security forces that could maintain domestic order and keep the terrorists out. And that's what we got.
And so when you came in, the war had been going on for a while. And so also from just a morale aspect, was there anything, that you implemented or any way that you kind of uplifted that morale and enthusiasm amongst the troops?
Yeah. Now, as the 4-star, I traveled around Iraq 3 or 4 times a week, visiting units down to, battalion level. That's about 1,000 people. And when I would talk to them, I would always try to be, uplifting, but bad things would happen. And I remember this one incident. The Marines had female Marines that they had at the checkpoints to search female Iraqis. And they were going around on a shift change, replacing the female Marines. And they had about 10 of them or so on a truck, and the truck hit an IED. And I think 7 or 8 of them were killed. It was a huge loss. And I found, it hit me. And I had to pick myself up before I could pick everybody else up and get them back on track. The thing though, that I really had to watch was myself. I had to learn to know when I wasn't at my best. It's really easy to get in a rhythm where you're going from meeting to meeting to meeting and you're not doing anything creative. You're checking the block. And when I got to that point, I said, you need a break. And I had three kinds of breaks. One was the short break where I'd do my morning update. Then I get on a plane and I'd fly to my boss's headquarters in Qatar. And I'd sit by the pool in the afternoon and read, have dinner with my boss, attend his update in the morning, and then fly back. That was good for another 2 or 3 weeks. I think twice, I snuck off to Amman for a weekend just to go there and get out of the combat zone and relax a little bit. And then when I came back to the States about every 6 months, and that was not a vacation, because when I came back to the States, I was doing media and Congress, and it was almost safer to stay in Iraq. But we managed to tack on a couple of respites onto that. But I had to really watch myself. And I developed a model as a brigadier in Bosnia that uses the acronym REST: read, exercise, sleep, and think. And I found I needed time every day to do that, to read something beside my email and my inbox and the intelligence, to exercise. And I exercise 4 or 5 days a week in Iraq and as the Army chief because I needed it. Sleep. I had to get the rest I needed to be effective. That was 6 or 7 hours a night. And I didn't get that every night, but that's what I tried for because that's what I needed. And then lastly is think. I needed time daily and periodically to sort things out in my head. Daily, I started my day for the last 7 years. I was in the Army at 6 o'clock with the intelligence book, and I read intelligence for 20 or 30 minutes. Then I took about 20 or 30 minutes organizing myself for the next couple of days, trying to figure out what I needed from my staff to do the things I needed to do so I could ask them and not be jamming them at the last minute. And then, because once my day started, meeting to meeting to meeting, and precious little time to actually think deeply about things. Actually, in Iraq, the only time outside of my mornings where I was able to think deeply about things was that when I was in the helicopter flying over the barren expanses of the Iraqi desert and just sitting there thinking. And then periodically, I found that if I didn't take some time periodically, I started off doing it monthly and then moved to weekly because monthly wasn't enough. But I needed quiet time by myself just to sort things out in my head. You get so many inputs that you're processing. If you don't take the time to sit down and sort them out. And then I found that if I wrote something at the end of these periods, it really helped me sharpen my thinking about where I thought we were and where we needed to go. So rest, read, exercise, sleep, and think. I personally follow that both in Iraq and as the Army chief.
So I'm kind of curious. You're now at the point where you're leading one of, I think, the most, in my recent memories, one of the craziest, periods of wartime. But before that, before, commander, before general, you're a father, you're a husband, and now, you're far away from home. How did you manage, the leadership aspect, but also giving time to family? You spoke about yourself. What about from the from family ass side of things?
When I first went to Bosnia, which was really the first deployment, I was gone for 6 months. That's when email first kind of hit us, and so we were able to send an email occasionally back to Germany. In Iraq, I had better communications in my bedroom than I did when I was the Army Chief of Staff. I mean, they were quite similar. So I tried to talk. I talked to my wife almost every night, unless I was out doing something. And we emailed regularly. And so that really, really made a difference. And then I got, I would try to get home periodically to see everybody. And one of the things I would do is I would spend Christmas in Iraq with the troops and go around and visit the mess halls and wish everybody Merry Christmas and finish up in Kuwait with the Army troops in Kuwait. And then I'd get on a plane and fly home. And we'd have a second Christmas for the grandkids. That stood me in very good stead. I said, you're having this Christmas because of me. He said, yes.
So I'm also curious, you had a lot of people that you were working with who were, a part of different American agencies, whether if it was different military branches. But outside of that, the Middle East, I'm sure you were also engaging with different foreign, governments, leaders. How did you take that information? It's one thing to, like, if Sean's coming to me and giving me information, I'm going to take his word for it. But now if I'm going through and a seller, for example, is telling us that this business is worth something, we're going to have to do our own research. Was there, I guess, periods where you felt that the people who you were working with were not giving you the best intelligence, or they didn't have the best interest for you?
Not really. I never felt that people were not trying to do their best.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, people have their own agendas and all the rest of that. I get that. But everybody was trying to do the right thing for the mission. This was people's lives were at stake. So there wasn't a lot of egos getting in the way and that kind of stuff. So I didn't really have that problem. For example, the ambassador worked for the Secretary of State. I work for the Secretary of Defense. That's two completely different constituencies. And if we found that if we sent a question back to Washington, they'd bicker over it for months. And so we tried to work everything, resolve the issues at our level. you have what I call your sphere of influence. And that's people who are outside of your direct control, whose support can help you accomplish what you're doing. And I found first I had to identify who I thought those people were. And then I had to go out and build relationships with them in advance. And for me in Iraq, it was the ambassador, it was the Iraqi prime minister, it was the Iraqi security ministers. I mean, these are people who didn't work for me, but had a stake in what we were trying to accomplish together. Then it was back in Washington, it was the Joint Chiefs, it was the Secretary of Defense. And people like that. So, I mean, I had to go out and influence all those people to get the things I needed for my mission. You know, when I was going around Washington in those early days, once I found out I was going to Iraq, everybody was saying, "Hey, General, just ask for whatever you need. We'll get right over to you. Really, we're here to support you." So I get over to Iraq and they said, "I need this." They say, "Why do you want that?" And I have to justify and make my case for why I wanted this. Now, it wasn't a trivial ask. I mean, I'm talking for hundreds of troops and billions of dollars, but you have to be able to influence people outside of your direct control if you're going to be effective. And so to your question here about, you're always going to have conflicting information, and whether it's willful or not, it doesn't matter. But I never made a decision where everything pointed this way. Right? You always have some pointing this way, some pointing that way. That's the way it is. And you have to sort your way throughout and figure out what are the most important things that I have to do to accomplish this. And those are the things that you focus on.
So, General, you talked about influence, and obviously in business, influence is you have to influence in negotiations, you have to influence your team. So when it came down to influencing, those other individuals around you, such as the Iraqi government or whoever it might be, what was your approach, and what kind of, you found worked for you or didn't work for you?
Well, I mean, a lot of it is issue specific, and you do the certain things depending on the issue that you're trying to resolve. But as I thought about this, and I talk about influence in the MBA course, first it starts with your reputation. I tried to build a reputation as a competent team player who's trying to do the right thing for the mission and I dealt with issues on their merits. And your reputation will precede you into these sessions. If people perceive you as someone who's just out for themselves, they'll be looking at you a little differently. So your reputation and your sphere of influence are kind of starters. Then you got to pick your battles. You can't joust at every windmill that comes at you. You got to sit down and say, how important is this to accomplishing what it is we're trying to do? And if it's the most important thing, then you probably ought to get after it. If it's not the most important thing, then maybe someone else goes after it, or maybe you don't do anything with it. But you can't joust at every windmill that comes at you. If you do that, you're just a pain in the butt. Then you got to take the time to know the other. You know the old Sun Tzu quote, "Know the other and know yourself, 100 battles without peril."
Yeah.
You got to invest in understanding what the other party is trying to accomplish, and because that's where you're going to be able to find common ground, and you'll be able to influence them. I constantly had to do that in Iraq with the Iraqi government. If you can imagine, their constituency was the Iraqi people. Mine was the U.S. government. They had very different needs and desires.
Objectives, yeah.
But I had to know what they were about. And interestingly, a lot of times the other party, it'll be obvious in your first couple of sessions, they don't really know what they want. And I found I had to help them figure out what they really wanted so we could go forward. Then you got to build a compelling case. You got to give them something to say yes to. Just because you think it's a good idea doesn't mean everybody else thinks it's a good idea. And you have to demonstrate that there's great value in what you're suggesting. And then lastly, once you do all that, you got to follow up. You got to live to fight another day, because you're not just going to do this once. You're going to do it over and over again. So a text, a phone call, email, a stop by the office. Thanks very much for your help. Appreciate it. Let me know what I can do for you. I tell folks, if you're going to succeed today, you control what you can, you influence what you don't control, and you prepare for what you can't. And it's influencing what you don't control is what we just talked about.
Sure. No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, we live in like a globalized world as well. And so, you're talking about influencing people from a different culture. And so, now in business, you might be dealing with someone that's in Dubai, or someone that's in Singapore or London, whatever the case might be. So just kind of cross culturally, was there some tactics that you used? Obviously some of those are going to cut across any culture, but when it came to, dealing with people that come from a different culture, or that speak a different language than you, Is there anything that worked for you there?
Yeah, I think first of all, I'd say that you have to expect differences of opinion. And when I talk about ambiguity, in Iraq, the Iraqis and us rarely saw things the same. We would say, "Oh, this happened, so this is what it means." And the Iraqis would say, "No, no, no, this is what it means." And we'd have to sit down and figure it out. So I had to accept that they had a much better view of the things that were going on in their country meant in terms of their culture. I had to be willing to accept that fact, and they did. Not surprisingly, they did know. The other thing I found about culture, and I've dealt with people in Bosnia and with Croats, Serbs, Bosniaks, dealt with Shia, Sunni, Kurds in Iraq. I go back to what my grandfather said. I tried to treat everybody with respect. That's kind of universal. If you treat people with respect, the door is open. Americans have a bad reputation of knowing all the answers and going in and, my way or the highway kind of thing. I read a book this side in grade school called The Ugly American. And it was about Americans abroad, doing exactly what I just said. And I tried never to be that kind of American. I found that treating people as people respectfully was always a good start point.
And I think that's truly what makes America really the best country, is the fact that, you have the opportunity to have debate, to have open discussions, to have differences in terms of, opinions or cultures, but being able to come together and get the job done. But, as we move forward, even with 2025, we're seeing a lot of split, a lot of differences, a lot of riots taking place, whether if it's for people's political beliefs or for something that's going across the sea. I'm certain that in your lifetime you've experienced periods of that, right? Where I guess America is split in terms of what they want. And in terms of dealing internally with your troops, I'm sure, how did you, I guess, going back to the influence, stay true to the mission, knowing, back home, people in the media might be criticizing or they might be saying this. How did you handle, I guess, the naysayers or the people that were who you call friends, or people back home that were maybe saying your plan's not working, this is not going right? How do you handle that situation?
Well, first of all, you have to expect it. My one of my favorites quote is the Theodore Roosevelt quote: "It's not the critic that counts. The one who points out how the strong man stumbled, the doer deeds could have done them better.
Yeah.
The credit belongs to the one who's in the arena, who's doing it." So you got all these yapping people. They're always going to be criticizing it. I mean, they just are. And I tuned it out. When I talked to the troops, people, the press were saying bad, things weren't going well in Iraq. And, I talked to the troops. Does this bother you? No, it doesn't bother us, but it bothers our families.
Yeah.
We're here doing our job. It bothers our families back in the States to hear that what we're doing isn't making a difference. And that was a hard one. And one of the things I constantly wrestle with, I had to tell the story about the positive things that were going on in Iraq. And there were positive things happening every day. But at the same time, they weren't necessarily outweighed by a car bomb or two in Baghdad that had a great visual blowing up on the screen. We were involved in a very long-term proposition. We didn't really appreciate how long when we went in. The ambassador and I realized about 6 months after we got there that this was not going to be an 18-month mission. That's what we were told when we first got there. And we started telling people, hey, this is a 5 to 10 year proposition here, folks. And that turned out to be what it took.
Okay. By the way, I listened to that exact Theodore Roosevelt that speech. I'll listen to it like every morning sometimes. It's one of my favorite, I guess, speeches out there.
When I walked into my office in the Pentagon on my first day as Army Chief of Staff, they had this big partner's desk. It came out of the War Department in the 80s, and it was all clear. And there was a quarter 5x8 card with that quote on it. My predecessor left for me to remind me that getting anything done in a difficult period for the Army was going to take courage.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. It's amazing. So, moving forward from there, just looking back, what decision are you most proud of during your time as Chief Army of Staff?
I guess it is not, well, one decision and two, and a series of decisions. The first decision was the decision to start a program I call Comprehensive Soldier Fitness, to give the soldiers the skills they needed to cope with the challenges of combat. We were sending soldiers into Iraq and Afghanistan without much preparation for the mental impacts that combat was going to have on them. And so we started a program to try to raise mental fitness to the same level that we gave to physical fitness. It was an uphill struggle because of the stigma associated with getting behavioral health care, but we tried to make mental fitness part of being a good soldier. And 16 years later, that program is still going on. It's changed names, but it's still the same program, and it's having a big impact. The second thing was it was a series of decisions that I made and got support from Secretary Gates for, that really left the Army in a far better and more stable position at the end of my tour than when I found it. I said, for my vision for the Army, the Army was out of balance, that it was so weighed down by the demands of Iraq and Afghanistan, we couldn't do the things we knew we needed to do to take care of our soldiers and families and prepare for the future. So I wanted to put that back in balance. And by the end of my tenure, we were pretty close to having accomplished that. And we got the Army through a very difficult period. So those are the two things.
Okay. Yeah, amazing. And yeah, those seem, I mean, I think mental health is for sure, we hear about it big nowadays, but especially back then it was kind of, there was a stigma and taboo around it. So um, definitely a very paramount, thing to incorporate, especially in the military. So that's amazing. So moving forward, now your transition from there to, civilian life, and after having such a high intensity career, how did you just slow down after doing all that for such a long period of time? Still figuring, are you still?
No, first 60 days wasn't enough to recover for almost 3 years in Iraq. And that's what I had transitioned. So I never really fully recovered for my time in Iraq and before I got on the bandwagon as the Army chief. And then I tried to do all of my congressional hearings before I left in April so that my successor wouldn't have to do any. And I did all, I think all 6 or 7 except one. And that was all in March and early April. And preparing for congressional hearings takes a lot of intellectual energy. And at the end of my time, I was spent intellectually. I couldn't concentrate enough to read a book. And so I told everybody, I'm going up to our beach house in Massachusetts, and I'm going to stay there for the summer. And I did. And the first thing I did when I got here was that I cut the grass, and I got the lawnmower out, and I made nice straight lines, and I overlapped them. And it was the first thing I'd started and finished in 10 years, but it was really fulfilling. At the end of that summer, on the 10th anniversary of September 11th, I rode with a group of recovering wounded from Ground Zero to Shanksville to the Pentagon in about 8 days. And that was my coming out party. And after that, I then started interacting with people and saying, well, really trying to figure out what I'd like to do. And one of the things you hear from veterans all the time is it's a little intimidating when you have to make choices, because in the military, you have the rank structure and you have your command structure, and you kind of go up the ladder. Now, when you're retired, you can do whatever you want, and it's a little intimidating to figure that out. I kind of knew I wanted to get into teaching leadership. It's something that I did my whole career in the Army, and I enjoyed it. Cornell gave me the opportunity, and I took it, and it's kind of, it's been 11 years now.
Okay. Yeah. And so, at Cornell, you've obviously worked with a lot of students and done a lot of leadership there. And also I know you work with business leaders as well. So, what parallels have you noticed between the military and corporate leadership?
If you just think about the 4 things that I say leaders need to do to be successful today, they're all things that leaders in any line of work need to do. Vision and strategy, building the team, delivering what it is you need for the team, and preparing for the future. It's all the same. I tell the business leaders, I might have had a $250 billion budget in the Army, but I never had to make a profit. So I don't do finance, but I can help you with the rest of it. And there's a lot of overlap. I tell the story all the time about, I had the leadership, Muhtar Kent, the chairman and CEO of Coca-Cola, and his direct reports came up to the Pentagon. and they spent a day with us talking about leadership. And I was giving them my spiel about influencing people outside of your direct control. All the direct report, they're all smiling. Finally, I said, why are you all smiling? They said the bottlers. They had to coax and cajole independent bottlers into doing the things they felt Coke needed to do to be successful. So all those, I mean, there's the softer skills are they're the same. They're the same. The financial stuff is something that I still need to work on.
Gotcha. And so yeah, and, you know, I think I definitely agree. That's what I've noticed as well is there's certainly some aspects that you kind of cut across all sectors when it comes to leadership. You know, in this generation, our generation's growing up in a very different world than the one you grew up in, with wars and rising inflation, shrinking middle class, recessions. So, you know, just what advice do you have to give to young Americans that are dealing with all this uncertainty and volatility in this current climate that we've been facing?
Control what you can, influence what you don't control, prepare for what you can't control. You can't get so intimidated by what's going on in the environment that you get on the back foot and you don't act. You have to sit down, do your homework, build conviction through the knowledge that you gain by doing your homework that what you're going to do is about right. You remember this from the class, right? In the Army, we say there's only two kinds of plans, those that might work and those that won't work. And because we're human, the best we're going to do is a plan that might work. So get a plan that might work, do something with it, and adjust and adapt as you go forward. You know, people ask me all the time, have you ever seen our country this divided? And I say, yeah, 1968. After Martin Luther King was assassinated, I stood on the roof of my dormitory at Georgetown and I watched Washington burn. I'm talking about billowing clouds of black smoke all across the skyline. Washington, D.C. Yeah, so between, you know, that and Vietnam, and we were more divided than we are today. Now, that said, we're also, the younger people today are much more attuned and they're much more conditioned to operating in that environment. But the big thing is, don't get out of whack on things that you have absolutely no control over. You can't sit around and wring your hands about all these things that might happen. You got to focus. The other thing I tell the MBAs is when you get to your new job, get as good as you can, as quick as you can at whatever it is the company's doing. Because as a young person, you'll get noticed first for your competence. And that's once you get people's attention, then you work from there.
Gotcha.
I'm curious, you know, we always we've asked a lot of, I think, very serious questions, but I'm kind of curious, General. This is just like one question that came to my mind. Do you have like a favorite all-time song or something that, you know, gets you going through the good and bad times? Anything that maybe you can look back from your childhood, just one song.
So this is I'm dating myself. But Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone.
Bob Dylan's great.
Yeah, that's my favorite.
Good pick, solid pick.
It's right up there, just above Billy Joel's Only the Good Die Young. But now like a Rolling Stone is the one that always gets me going, gets my foot tapping.
Love that.
And then since you talked about, I have to ask you, since you talked about, you know, books and you certainly are an avid reader, you know, your favorite book or, you know, your top two that are kind of that you think are crucial to read.
You know, the book that I used to give generals when they got promoted to general was David McCullough's Path Between the Seas. And it's a story about the building of the Panama Canal. And it's a story of failed strategic leadership and successful strategic leadership. The French effort failed. Roosevelt saw the opportunity and created the opportunity to create a path between the seas to move our fleets back and forth between the oceans. And then you had to read an article about this in the class, but Jim Collins has a book called Great by Choice. And I have the students, business school students, read an article about that. But basically the subtitle is How to Manage Through Chaos. And he offers a framework built around consistency for success today. And it's very interesting. One of the things that I find that people want to be agile. Right? Everybody wants to be agile, but there's a temporal dimension to agility. And it's up to the leader to ensure that the organization understands how long this bit of agility is expected to take. It might take a year, it might take 2 years, it might take 3 years. But people need to know that, because if you don't tell them that, they think it has to happen next week. And I found that there needs to be some structure around the agility. I mean, unless you're a really, really small company. There has to be some structure so that people can follow you and the standards within the organization are maintained.
Awesome. Thank you so much, General George Casey. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
All right, wonderful to see you both.
Yeah, and thank you for your service and everything that you've done, for